Well, welcome to our first town hall of 2026. So I would like to begin by acknowledging the Warringah and HMAS people as the traditional custodians of the land on which we are meeting tonight, and pay my respects to elders past and present, and to those of the future, and acknowledge their spiritual connection to country. My name's Jill Bryant. I'm Zali's Electorate Business Manager, but I met many of you last year when I was Zali's campaign manager. Doesn't seem a year ago. But you were part of the 1,400 strong volunteer team in Warringah, the beating heart of community independent movement. And it is thanks to that community that we're here today. The electorate office itself serves many purposes, but primarily we are there to support the community, to support Zali to deliver the promises that she made to the electorate. And that was to make everyone feel safe, supported, and strong. Specifically, Zali has promised to deliver on climate resilience and household electrification, social cohesion, with a focus on domestic violence and generational inequity, integrity through truth in political advertising and gambling reform. And shortly, Zali's going to come up and talk to you about the progress in those areas and more. I would also like to share that as well as an exceptional band of volunteers, Zali also enjoys the support of an exceptional team in the electoral office, where everyone gives 110% to ensure that they can deliver the support the community needs across NDIS, aged care, Centrelink, visa issues, often supporting people through some of the worst times, responding to over 2,000 cases so far this year alone. And as you can imagine, Zali's inbox fills up every time you take your eyes off it. But it's these cases and these emails that enable the constituent liaison team to inform the parliamentary team, who are also here tonight, with what matters to the community, how you feel about key issues. And in turn, this ensures that Zali can represent these views when she's in Canberra. But that's enough about us. Let me hand over the mic to your independent member for Warringah, Zali Steggall.
Thank you, Jill. And is this high enough? I don't need to go a bit higher. Thank you, Jill. Is it good? Loud enough? Yep, all right. And welcome everyone. Thank you. It's great to see a full house for this town hall. Always great to have so many members of the community here. As Jill did, but I would also like to acknowledge the traditional elders of the land on which we're meeting, the HMAS people, as the traditional custodians of the land. And noting, of course, Warringah voted 60% during the Voice campaign. And so I have been focused on looking at how can we continue that allyship with First Nations. And to that extent, and for that purpose, I've moved a number of amendments to give First Nations greater voice and recognition within legislation, but also our office is engaging in a reconciliation action plan. And we are actually the first electoral office to do that, and hopefully we will encourage others to do that because it sets in train our government, and that will be launched on the 12th of June. Now, thank you in registering for this event. I know many of you have lodged questions, and there were quite a few. There were a few that we can certainly group into areas. A hot topic issue locally, of course, HMAS Penguin, and I hope some of you saw we have some maps at the entrance there, and I've got some updates to provide. The question around social and affordable housing development in Warringah, and of course, housing developments that are occurring here in Mosman as well. Electrification, climate risk, insurance affordability, geopolitical issues, conflict in the Middle East, there were many questions on that. And then, of course, what can we expect out of the upcoming budget with floated changes to negative gearing and capital gains tax exemptions? So I'll get to those questions, but I thought first I could start with a bit of an overview of what's been happening in Parliament. Of course, we see what happens here locally in the community, but there is a bit of a bubble when it comes to Canberra, and just to provide a bit of an update there. So I would argue the current government's agenda has been fairly reactive to issues, and has been framed around crisis management rather than being proactive or looking at doing careful reform. Some of the key bills we've had in the last 12 months since the election Some have been good and are very much supported. The Universities Accord, cutting student debt by 20%. That was great for young people and that issue they face. There are still amendments needed in relation to student debts. It's to the date of indexation is still incredibly unfair. We've also seen legislation around instant asset write-offs and scams, so that's assisting small businesses. But even there was more that could have been done, and tried to get the government to move amendments to make those instant asset write-offs permanent and of a higher number, so that there could be greater support for businesses. Now, in terms of other legislations, there's a long list of legislations, but we've also had laws around super changes we had a strong campaign across the crossbench and the opposition to push for that unrealised capital gains would not be included in any superannuation changes, and that was successful and didn't go through. The government also tried to restrict access to information, so freedom of information law changes, and that we strongly oppose that as well, because I think it's an important part of integrity and accountability that the public and news media can make freedom of information requests to have access to what is influencing decision making in government, and so the government has had to abandon those law changes when it comes to freedom of information. Other piece of legislation that was fairly controversial was late last year the Environment Protection Reform Bill went through, so that was also part of the EPBC, Environmental Protection, Biodiversity and Conservation Act. It's a bit of a mouthful. And that was a bit of a mixed bag. I was not satisfied with those amendments, that they were really going to strike the right balance between environmental conservation and protection and business. Other areas, of course, they also relied on environmental standards, which we haven't seen yet, that will come through regulation. Other areas, on a good note though, I will say we've recently had the High Seas Biodiversity Bill passed, and the recognition around Treasury laws, genetic testing protections in life insurance. So many from within the community, I don't know how many here tonight, wrote in fact about that concern around genetic testing being able to be compelled when it comes to getting premiums for insurance. And it was really important that we not have this disincentive for people to get the tests that modern medicine allows, and that be counted against access to insurance, because there was a real disincentive. So really important aspect of that, and that was very much a community-led campaign across Australia. Of course, this year there's been other areas where we've been called to Parliament, obviously after the horrendous terrorist attack in Bondi pre-Christmas, meant that in January we were in Parliament to deal with gun reform laws and the hate speech laws, and I'll touch on them in a moment. But I guess more recently, as I mentioned, the High Seas Biodiversity Bill was a great accomplishment, because it's been about 20 years that people have been pushing for that recognition of that treaty, of ratifying the treaty. So there was an element of celebration, and I think as an island nation, protection of our oceans is incredibly important. In terms of what I've done with the government, I've moved to Private Members Bill, again pushing for that Electoral Communications Bill, trying to get truth in political advertising. I think again that the fact that we are protected from scams and misinformation as consumers, but we don't protect voters and voting rights from misinformation remains a huge gap in our system. I met with Don Farrell about this just actually last sitting week, and whilst the government remains in a formal sense committed to doing something about this, he is non-committal about just when they are going to act on it. I suspect they still like having the loophole to use it when it's convenient. The main area I also raised was in this era of AI and deep fakes and regenerative and how so much stuff can be created online, that at the very minimum the government should be introducing legislation to compel watermarking content where it is AI generated. So even if we're not going to have truth in political advertising, at the very minimum the standard should be that you should be viewer informed. So if you are watching something AI generated, you should be able to know that, because it's very sophisticated and you can't always tell. You know, we think we might be able to know, but we don't actually always. The more outlandish stuff, you can tell, but there's plenty of stuff that you can't. I also introduced the Climate Change National Adaptation Framework Bill. Now that's been a big piece of work that many in the community have contributed to, and that's around a framework to make sure we assess our national risk assessment nationally. We do so regularly. The government has done one national climate risk assessment in 2025. It was a one-off and they haven't responded to it or put any kind of measures against it to actually deal with that and invest in resilience. So that bill is trying to compel the government to in fact deal with this problem and risk, because it is so linked to our household budgets through insurance premiums, and I've done a lot of work with the Insurance Council of Australia around just how exposed so many Australians are, and the bulk of their assets often sits in the family home, and that family home is incredibly at risk. So that sense that there is that we just need to start investing in that climate resilience is incredibly important. And I hosted a forum where, in fact, we had the Australian Local Government Association attend, who talked about how so many of the solutions are known at local government level, but they don't have the funding or the means to deliver that. And these are things like levies with better stormwater drainage, all the things that can assist then mitigate the risk and the exposure when it comes to insurance for community members. Now that is something that I will continue to push for. I've pushed for it for the upcoming budget, and that's a piece of work we really can't ever let up on, because I think we need that investment as a matter of urgency to keep our communities safe. In terms of amendments, my commitment is to keep trying to improve legislation from the government and to work with them and the opposition around how do we actually improve legislation, and that can sometimes be just the parliamentary workplace trying to change the definition of disorderly conduct in the House. You'll be amazed to know that in the chamber we actually don't have intimidating, harassing and bullying behaviour as part of the standing orders as being inappropriate in that workplace, which is quite outrageous, but I'm pushing for that to change. I've moved amendments on behalf of Warringah around the Home Affairs legislation bill to protect rights of children, around, as I mentioned, the instant asset write-offs to be made permanent and increased for small businesses, and asset write-off to be focused on climate adaptation and electrification. Around the EPBC Act, so those environmental bills, I moved amendments around duty of care into our environmental protection legislation, the duty of care to future generations. If we're conserving the environment, who are we conserving it for? I think it's an important, a lot of people think it's inferred, but it actually isn't. The Court of Appeal has said it needs to be made more explicit. Climate-related financial disclosure, and then the impacts should be, cumulative environmental impacts of projects should be considered under the EPBC Act. So of course what happens all too often is large-scale projects are fragmented and each individual project is assessed for its environmental impact, but they don't assess the cumulative impact. And obviously that then hides away the true impact on the environment of that project. Around communication legislation bill, that was about protecting Australian content and screen quotas. So of course there we have incredible artists and content coming from Australia, and making sure that they are getting a fair representation on our online screening devices and screening platforms to ensure that children's content and producers and writers, and we have that homegrown industry. And it was great to see so many people in the community get behind that campaign. In fact, we have a lot of producers and creators in Warringah, and so that meant a lot for them to have that protection in the legislation. Around the urgent legislation we dealt with in January around combating anti-Semitism, the firearm and custom laws bills, pushing again to make sure that, especially where there's incidences of domestic violence, that being more considered at a greater level when it comes to gun ownership, and that we have more of a national register around that. It's something I would have assumed we already did, but we actually don't. Greater protections can still be included. And then in relation to combating anti-Semitism, criminal and migration law bills, broadening the definition of hate crime, The legislation as it passed was only on the basis of race. I did support the legislation, but I did seek to broaden it through an amendment that it should protect on the basis of race, religion, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, intersex status or disability, which are the areas of protection that are consistent in all our other anti-discrimination laws. So trying to make sure that we have that hate speech and hate crime and anti-Semitism across all of those areas. Again, I also put up amendments around protecting the rights of children when it comes to rights of questioning, and around, then we went to the NAIF, which is the Northern Australia Infrastructure Fund, so public funding of a lot of assets that I don't think we should continue funding through public funds, fossil fuel projects. They are mature technologies that have more than enough funds available to pay for their own projects. Around migration, around looking at the question of making sure we have a fair and effective migration system. And more recently, we had urgent legislation pushed by the government around suspending valid visas. And obviously my concern is around the procedural fairness of that aspect. Question time, always a lively period to watch Parliament. But we have a roster around the crossbench about how we get to questions and how we, they are known as questions without notice, so often try and catch the government or the Prime Minister on the hop to get a proper reaction and not a pre-prepared answer. And I've asked questions from protecting future generations around emissions reduction, adaptation and resilience, plastic pollution, which a lot of people raise with me, economic reform, climate risk, local content quotas, gambling advertising, where we have a proposal from the government, but it is really not yet following the recommendations of banning online gambling advertising. We are record holders in Australia for gambling losses, a huge amount of losses yearly, and it is a massive problem for young men in particular, are targeted by that advertising, and it has such a detrimental impact. I've called for a Royal Commission into domestic violence because I'm frustrated that we as a nation still have a crisis that is not changing fast enough. Making sure that we, as uphold international human rights and legally engage, how countries engage in military conflict, and so I have raised the case of Zomi Frankham on behalf of her family, she was the aid worker killed a little over 2 years ago providing aid in Gaza. I have asked around HMAS Penguin and the proposed partial divestment, and I'll touch, of course, on more detail on that. Truth in political advertising and getting proper revenue for tax gas exports. So trying to be fairly broad around the topics that are covered in question time. Of course, in a few weeks we'll have the 2026 budget, and the government has flagged some areas that it's going to focus on. It has flagged some elements of tax reform, which I do welcome. We need some budget repair and we need to modernise our tax system. We can't continue with a system that overwhelmingly burdens work, productive work, active work, if I should put it that way, and with an ageing population, that is problematic for maintaining the revenue to be able to then provide the services. So there is indication from the government that it is going to wind back some of the benefits to investors around negative gearing and capital gains tax discount for investment properties. I haven't seen the detail yet, but we have been urging the government to find the courage to start addressing these issues. Housing is a major problem everywhere in Australia, but just as much here as well. Housing stress, it's a growing issue, especially from an intergenerational point of view. We have very low vacancy when it comes to rental and very low affordable housing for teachers and nurses, aged care workers, people that are very much on that front line of services that we so desperately need in the community. We know from young people they are very frustrated. They feel locked out of home ownership, and essential workers are having to travel further and further to come and do those jobs that we need within our community. And unfortunately, and it's a statistic that I think is forever shameful, older women over 55 remain one of the fastest groups facing at risk of homelessness, which I think is really, really telling. So we do want residents of every age group to be able to afford to stay in the community. It's really important that we have that intergenerational fairness. We, with other members of the crossbench, who have been regularly calling on the Treasurer and the Government and the Prime Minister to address those issues. I have been calling around climate resilience to be made a national priority and needs to increase that spend. Currently it is just minimal, and the majority of expense goes to emergency response management. So you're never about mitigating the problem, it's only ever about cleaning up the problem after the events have happened, which means we are never going to reduce the cost of those events. It's only going to be this bigger and bigger cost on the budget. So I have called on the government to establish a dedicated climate resilience fund, and this doesn't have to be a negative impact on the budget. We have had Parliamentary Budget Office assessments of if we wound back the diesel fuel excise that goes to mining. Of course, keeping it for agriculture, because from an we need to make sure that agriculture it remains. But if we just wind it back for mining and heavy transport, where there are options, that can pay for a dedicated climate resilience fund of about 30 million over 3 years. So it's considerable, and we can do that. Now, of course, we can also do budget repair through fairer resource taxation, and there is an inquiry on in Parliament just now with the Senate inquiry around how do we tax our gas exports. Now, this gas, it's all of ours. Australians own it. It is Australia's resource. It is being exported at great profit and very little revenue for the Australian people. It's something like $2 million an hour and 50 million a day of revenue that could be recouped for the Australian people to pay for all the things that we know we're going to hear in the budget in a few weeks' time, that the government has to, we all have to take some cuts and we can't afford certain services because of managing that budget, yet there is plenty of revenue that is available, and it is Australia's resource, it's Australian people's. Of course, there are incentives in place around electrification. Now, that's been a big focus of mine since being in politics, is how do we take advantage of new technologies and electrification. We know in these times of global uncertainty and wars, no one controls the wind and the sun, and so a very clear way of having energy security is relying less on imports and more on domestically made energy. Now, certain industries still rely on gas, there's no doubt about it, but the more we electrify what we can, the more we prioritise gas for the uses where it's needed, and that would bring down prices. Of course, we had recently, the government passed legislation around the 30-cent cut to the fuel excise because costs were getting out of control and still are. The difficulty I've got with that is that was not means tested, so that was just made blanket at the Bowser, was absorbed within about 3 days as gas prices climbed regardless, and that will have a huge hit to the budget bottom line. In terms of locally, I've tried best. We get a lot, as Jill said, a lot of emails, a lot of contact about a lot of issues. I've hosted a number of roundtables with organisations to try and hear from as many groups as possible. I've done Youth Voices leaderships at Mosman High, and I have to thank the school for hosting it. I've done a roundtable around climate risk and resilience. Parliamentary Friends of Climate Action, I'm the co-chair around eating disorders and oceans and sustainable development. We've hosted a housing roundtable with state and federal leaders. I've met regularly with the Chambers of Commerce because first and foremost, our local businesses are doing it incredibly tough. I've been advocating for them with, for example, around sponsored visas. The skilled visa pathway is incredibly expensive to local businesses, and they do rely on it to be able to get roles filled. And of course, the screen industry produces domestic violence, and then NDIS. Now, coming up, there is projected cuts to the NDIS in this upcoming budget. Now, I don't think anyone would disagree that we need to make sure NDIS remains affordable and fit for purpose as it was intended. It does need guardrails, and we need to make sure any cases of fraud are acted upon and cracked down on. But what we don't want is to see a program that leaves a void in the middle for vulnerable people. And the government has introduced a program called Thriving Kids, which will take care of the younger members of the community that are under NDIS. But that has been delayed to 1st of October. So there is a great amount of concern, and you may have seen, obviously I've raised my concerns in the media, that any cuts to NDIS before new programs are implemented leave families and participants vulnerable, and obviously would set back progress and a lot of, and actually defers costs. It's not an ultimate cost saving, because what happens is other systems end up having to bear the brunt of that increased reliance. And as I've, said in the media, the budget is a question of priorities for the government, of where it wants to spend and where it wants to cut. And so it will be very telling to see whether it is not willing to find the courage to better recruit revenue for the Australian people from its resources, rather than just cutting on the essential services for the more vulnerable in our community. Local issues. The community had a phenomenal win at the Milsons Point Post Office. Again, raised it in Parliament. I met with the PM. Ironically, he's a resident, so I could argue that it was his local post office. Raised it in Parliament, and obviously huge community advocacy. Saw Australia Post reverse its course, which was a fantastic win. Now, there are many other post offices that we've obviously raised concern about, and I know many of you have with me. And so that's an ongoing battle, with Australia Post to make sure we maintain that balance between they want, commercial viability of their services versus the essential service that a post office offered to local residents, especially senior members of our community, and especially up at Milsons Point, social housing tenants and small businesses. So, now, we've got a number of questions that have been put to, and I thought I've grouped them, and I should thank, I've got Anne-Marie Kimber here, the Mayor of Mosman, so I thought we would keep the Mosman-specific ones to a little minute so that we can cover them together. First, questions around local transport infrastructure. Well, of course, it is a state responsibility. Where federal comes into it is if it's a significant infrastructure that requires funding, then it gets put on the Infrastructure Australia priority list. We do have 2 congestion points in Warringah that are on that list, and I'm constantly pestering state government to maintain that request from federal to keep it as a priority. Since the Beaches Link Tunnel was shelved by state government, I've been pressing for what is Plan B. What are they going to do about congestion? Because I know this is such a problem. And we are so exposed to public transport and buses. Ironically, that does cross-section with, I've met with carriers down there around the buses, and they have bus driver shortages and have asked me to advocate for a skilled visa pathway for bus drivers, because they do not get enough bus drive, that they simply don't get people from our community applying for those jobs. I suspect there's a pay dispute going on, but to try and assist them in getting more drivers so that they can put more buses on the road to help with that transport. I've also asked the state government around an assessment of Spit Bridge. It is an ageing piece of infrastructure, and what the alternative is. Obviously, that corridor between Brookvale to Chatswood is a very important corridor to divert traffic from the Military Road congestion. And there is a review occurring, I believe in September, from state government, but of course more pressure needs to be put there. I'm not in state government, so there's only so much I can do from where I stand to press the state government on that issue. But that is an important, the Warringah Road, Pittwater Road office work intersection, it's on the other side of Spit Bridge, but many of you probably know. It is a major bottleneck, and if we can divert more traffic coming from the peninsula on that axis, it would assist the congestion. Now, the 2, I think, big issues locally are housing density. So, of course, thank you to Anne-Marie Kimber for being here, and I do really welcome that the Council has developed a long-term master plan on housing density. The housing crisis has seen state government impose mid to higher density requirements on local government areas, and not in a very strategic way. They are looking at maps from a sense of distance, not a sense of topography. It really is problematic, and I know for many in the community there are developments that are really concerning. So I do really welcome that the Council has now led this long-term master plan on housing density, on where some housing density can be accommodated and where it should not be, to redistribute that more strategically and respond to the New South Wales low and mid-rise reforms and better account for local infrastructure capacity. Now, I am mindful, young people are saying they need somewhere to live. They are not able to live within our communities. So that sensible low to mid-rise needs to be found, and I look forward to seeing the master plan from the local government to see how that can be achieved. Because we need to make sure we do manage that intergenerational issue, but also making sure we have people that can live in our community to do those essential services. We need teachers, aged care nurses, we need police, ambulance, we need those essential people to be able to still live within our communities, to work and do those essential roles, without losing the feel of our communities by having inappropriate developments in the wrong places. Now, HMAS Penguin, obviously a lot of rumours that there was an investigation and an audit, and then the government dropped their assessment. My understanding from the Minister was that this was done, I'm concerned that it was done a little bit from Canberra, from an administrative point of view, of looking at defence assets on paper rather than coming and seeing them all in person. There was an assessment of what services were delivered where and what was essential, what could be moved and what had value. Now, of course, anyone looking at land values in Balmoral or Mosman would jump to certain conclusions. But that is something that I strongly object to. And during my briefing with the Minister, I was testing the position of the government in relation to this proposed partial divestment. And the Minister's words were that they would seek to have full and fair market value, and I contested that immediately. Now, I would argue defence assets are not there for the government of the day to just be sold off. They're held on trust by Defence on behalf of the Australian people. They're really important assets. You look at our Sydney Harbour foreshore, and there's clear all of the headlands have been very specifically designated for preservation and conservation, or for defensive and very strategically for defence. It's really important that that be preserved. Now, what the government has indicated that it will be a partial divestment. There's a lot of fluidity in what that means, and trying to pin them down to that has been interesting. I did meet with Minister for Finance, Katie Gallagher, because what's going to happen is there's about 135 sites for divestment from Defence. Penguin is I think the only one that is a partial divestment proposal. And it gets basically transferred to Treasury and to Finance, and then they have to proceed with that process. So I got in very quickly to meet with Katie Gallagher to express the concerns of the community, that there was strong objection to this partial divestment proposal, to press that it was a very complex site with strong opposition. Look, she made it very clear to me that there was two tranches of process going about with this, and of the 135 odd sites, they were proceeding with the simple sites first, where there wasn't community objections. So Penguin is in tranche 2, and I would argue probably at the bottom of tranche 2, because they are very aware that it is complex and objected to. In terms of the process, They are arguing that they will relocate defence personnel, or some of defence personnel, while retaining the site's critical diving capability. And I've visited the base, and it's got an incredible history. In terms of the proposed divestment, what we know so far is that it involves some of the existing buildings and the untouched bushland. Now, in terms of and that is not a definite thing. I think that's what's really important for the community. It's still a proposal, and there is, I think, plenty of opportunity for the community to really object and raise concerns around this. The difficulty, of course, is that the existing buildings identified for divestment are quite old buildings with a high maintenance cost. And Defence is arguing that they do not want to bear that maintenance cost, that they are underutilising. Now, these are their words, it's not my view. The question will be, is that correct or not? And ideally, we really need Defence to be able to say what their utilisation of that accommodation is, how often do they use it, do they have it at full capacity, and argue, I hope, that it should be kept within Defence for their use when it comes to training and other operations that happen out of the base or in broader Sydney. Very much that those buildings should be maintained within Defence. If Defence is of the view they cannot manage that cost, that it's a cost they do not want to continue to bear, the fallback position I would suggest must be that there can be no new buildings, that only existing buildings are there, and those existing buildings should be maintained for public good, and that no new buildings occur, and that certainly you don't have private developers or anything like that occur. And that's where I've suggested that if there has to be a divestment of buildings, that the appearance should not change, the conservation should be continued, but that it shouldn't be, these buildings shouldn't be transferred to, I don't know, a private hotel or anything like that, that they should remain for community benefit through social and affordable housing. So I know there's been a bit of misinformation and sort of concern around that position. That does not mean any new buildings. It's simply saying that if we have an existing building that the Defence does not want to maintain the cost of, the maintenance cost of that building is considerable, and so its use should be for community benefit and social benefit. In relation to the bushland, there's about 5% that should very much be protected. There's only 5% of native vegetation that remains across the whole north shore of Sydney Harbour, and when you look at some of those maps and zoom out, you see how little there is. And so I very much pressed on the Minister that bushland should be conserved, and should, if it is to be divested from Defence, then it should be put into National Park or the Harbour Trust for conservation. That under no circumstances should that bushland be developed or lost. The Minister's perception was this is a complex site with a lot of considerations, and very keen to consult with the community and engage and hear those concerns. And I think it would be really important to have the kind of reports and conservation reports that will very much establish that uniqueness and the need to preserve those areas. To that extent, we did get good news this week. The Defence Department are going to come and have a first community consultation at the Allan Border Oval Pavilion on Friday, 8th of May. So put that in the diary. And that will be an opportunity where Defence will, I guess, answer questions and provide a little more information about their plans. And I think that will be another opportunity to raise all the concerns I know there are within the community. Now, I think I might take this opportunity to give Anne-Marie an opportunity to maybe give us an update from obviously, it's been very important that we all work together on this issue on behalf of the community. And so looking at, from a local government's perspective, I think the housing and...
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Zali. And I'd just like to, well, first of all, start with thanking all of you for coming tonight. I actually didn't turn around to see that we do have a full house, and it really just shows your genuine interest in what Zali has to say and some of the issues that are affecting us locally. But I'd also like to thank you, Zali, for all the work that you do. It makes me feel like I'm not busy enough. You seem to be doing an awful lot more. But also, sincerely thank you for the advocacy that you are doing for us around HMAS Penguin. Zali and I happened to be in Canberra together for an event for International Women's Day when the news broke that Defence were considering divesting out of Penguin. So we've been in consultation since then because this is a federal issue, but very much localised to us and will impact on Mosman. So I really appreciate working together with Zali. We're both very committed to working with the community, making sure we're fully representing the community's feelings about this and their needs, and I absolutely concur that this is not land that should be available for sale. It is land that's being held in trust by our government for the Australian people, and it should remain so. So I concur on all of that as well. What I would like to say is that I just want to give you a bit of an update on what we've been doing locally. I'll just start back with transport very quickly. I'm not sure if you're all aware of, and Zali touched on it, the Northern Beaches Network review, which was a review that was done after the tunnel didn't go ahead. That review, the results of that first review have now been released and open for community input. So if you go online, there's an interactive map where you can click anywhere on that map from North Sydney to Palm Beach and identify where you see there's an issue around traffic, transport and roads, and they will be looking at all of that over the next few months with a view to coming up with some kind of solution. I did hear yesterday they've hired 30 bus drivers from New Zealand to come and work at the Northern Beaches. So at least that's a bit of a solution, because that is a bottleneck for us, is getting bus drivers up there. So that was the one thing. Just touching very briefly on the master plan process and where that's up to, for those of you who are not in the know. I'll just give a very brief summary. You'd all be probably aware by now of the low mid-rise housing planning policy that came out last year. We've been strongly advocating around that as to a solution that's better suited to Mosman, that's bottom up as opposed to top down imposed upon us. Through that very strong and ongoing advocacy, we have been able to secure a position that we're in now where we are actually working with the Department of Planning. We're one of the only councils, if not the only council in Sydney, that is in the position where we are working with the Department of Planning on compiling our own alternative to the LMR in the form of a long-term strategic master plan for Mosman. We are over halfway through doing that. That would normally take 2 to 2.5 years to do a master plan like that. We have expedited that, and we've got all the different projects that go along with that, including an affordable housing policy and infrastructure review, all of these extra components that need to go together in that master plan. We're running them all at the same time so that we can expedite this into an 8-month time period. We're already halfway through, over halfway through that. And on the 28th of April, we will be putting out to the community a suite of documents around this master plan. And two of the most important parts were the principles on which we are building that master plan, and also 2 potential options, which is a slightly wider and lower option that centres more around the Spit Junction and the Spit Military Road corridor, and then a narrower, higher option, which means we could go quite significantly higher. And now we're putting that out to the community on the 28th of April, if you want to look out for that, because it's very important that as many from the community as possible get involved in having their say about that. We'll have all sorts of pop-ups and drop-in sessions, and we'll be meeting with the business community and a number of other ways where you can have your say on that. So please look out for that. Now, very quickly, one last thing with regard to what we're just doing around HMAS Penguin, just to let you know what we've been doing. We've brought this up at the last 2 council meetings, where we've all unanimously agreed on a process that we would follow. Some of that has been me writing to the Minister for Defence and the Minister for Finance, inviting them to come to site and meet with me to discuss I've also been to site and walked around that with the commander there, and also just advocating for the protection of that land. We've done a lot of work in the media to make sure that our messaging is getting out there. I've done a lot of updates, video updates to the community, so I will continue to do those. And what are some of the other things? I'm also going to the National General Assembly in a few weeks, which is the National Local Government Association annual conference, basically. I've put forward a motion there because this is a federal issue. It's an opportunity for me to highlight the issue at a national level, and I'm hoping to get the opportunity to speak to that. And we also did a submission to the Senate inquiry last week on the divestment of defence assets, and highlighted all the issues that Zali and I both touched on today. So that advocacy will be ongoing. Zali and I will hopefully keep working our hardest from the federal level and the local level to do what we can to make sure the community's voice is heard. So thanks very much, Zali. Thank you.
Thank you. And I should say I will also be making that submission, but I've kept mine in draft because I want to hear from the community first before submitting that submission to the inquiry. But I am confident that there is time for us to get our ducks in a row and reports and the arguments, sensible arguments, to make sure that the partial divestment does not go ahead and that the community views are respected. Now, I'm just asking Jill, in relation to questions, we've covered a lot of the other ones, but I believe there's going to be a live process. Has any... The government is indicating that they have a number of tax reforms that they are considering. Obviously, we won't know for sure until budget night. At the moment, it appears that they are open to reducing the capital gains exemption on investment properties, so no changes to the family home, but on investment properties that it would go from a 50% to a 33%. So, again, though, this is all very much speculative. Okay, I'm not going to be able to see that from here, so I'm going to...
What are you seeing as an opportunity during this global energy crisis to turbocharge renewable energy?
Yeah, I mean, look, there's, I am an EV driver, and I certainly am thankful for that when I look at where prices are. There's a lot of misinformation around electric vehicles, around insurance, around range, around battery life. So I'd encourage everyone to really get informed about that. And in fact, we've got at the table at the entrance an EV handout with some information, and we've prepared a sustainability guide to help households electrify, but also to better understand what's available for assistance around EVs. There's no doubt that the current Iran war and the crisis is a really stark reminder that not only do we, 90% of Australian fuel is imported, we only have 2 refineries. One just recently had the fire and is out of action, which means we are incredibly exposed to imported fuel. And that's really dire when it comes to our food production and agriculture, and how much fuel we hold, and what successive governments' policies has been around how much fuel we hold. We hold about 30 days, it fluctuates a little bit, but we've had regular briefings from the government around their ability to get new shipments and make sure we have that supply ongoing. The problem is the cost. To secure those additional shipments and ships, it is coming at an increased cost, that fuel, and the government is underwriting that to ensure they are prioritising supply to make sure that farmers and regional communities in particular have the fuel they need. And so at the moment it is at any cost, right? The government is underwriting it, so that's very expensive, but it is that reminder of it's an opportunity for behaviour change, to use public transport where it's available, but also to look at electric vehicles.
Should Australian citizens who fight for the IDF be investigated for war crimes upon their return to Australia?
Look, Australia is a signatory and upholds international law. If there are international court proceedings, I think it's important that that be upheld. That question of investigation, I think, is difficult and complex in a conflict, in a war situation. I am concerned around international law and rules of engagement that are occurring currently in some of our conflicts, in particular the targeting of humanitarian aid and medical aid. That is really concerning. There is a multiple tap strategy that is incredibly concerning. So I think the individual identification will be very difficult, as Zomi Frankham's case highlights. Getting a full investigation from the government in relation to that is proving difficult.
Are you supportive of the 25% tax rate on gas, noting that if we were in Norway, that rate would be a multiple of that percentage?
Well, as I said, yes, we've got to be really clear. The call around that 25%, it's on gas exports, right? Because currently we export about 80% of the gas that is dug up out of Australian gas, and we get very little revenue. So the government introduced in 2023 what's called the Petroleum Resource Rent Tax, a PRRT, and that was meant to start bringing back a fairer return for the Australian people. Treasury made a recommendation to Jim Chalmers that it could be around a range of 80 to 90% that could be deducted before the PRRT applied. The government listened to the gas industry and applied the 90%, so only 10% essentially is subject to it, and there is a 7-year payback period. So gas companies, before the PRRT applies, there is 7 years of extraction, and then they can write off their costs of investment into it, even though they've already deducted those costs around any company tax they might pay and those kind of things. They are deducted against any PRRT that might be payable, up to 90% of those expenses incurred. So there's a bit of, I would argue, double dipping when it comes to this process. It's very complex, and for the last 3 budgets, the government has had to downgrade revenue expectations from the PRRT. And that's why many experts have said it's a broken system, it is not fit for purpose, and a 25% export tax is what's needed. Now, of course, some of our export nations like Japan and Singapore and others are very concerned about that. But I think today I found out an even more concerning fact that the Japanese government makes more revenue from taxing the import of Australian gas than we make from the export of Australian gas, which I just thought was just, if there was ever sublime to the ridiculous of a system that is not working, it has to be that. So yes, I do. It's $2 million an hour that could be in revenue for Australian people.
And these are moving around, but I'm going to ask you this one because it's different. Have you consulted with young people in Warringah on issues most affecting them? If so, what did you find to be the most pressing, and what are your solutions?
Yes. Well, I try and regularly consult with young people, and they're not always engaged in politics, but we have a youth forum where all the schools and the school captains come, and we very much have a discussion, and they raise the issues they're concerned about. A key area they are concerned around is housing and access to housing, the careers they will have for the future, and they're very worried about AI. They are very worried about what jobs will remain, what disruption there will be, and how are we protecting certain jobs or enabling transition. So government has traditionally put in place support packages when industries are disrupted and changing. So, for example, where mining of thermal coal, there are great programs in place to help people needing to transition within those communities. There is still a complete void from the government when it comes to acknowledging the disruption of the AI will cause to certain industries and professions, but also the opportunities. We still don't have the guardrails in place around the question of the environmental impact or the sort of the accountability piece that's needed. We need to embrace the opportunity, but have the guardrails to make sure it's done safely. So that is an area that is very troubling to young people. They don't want AI in schools, for example, and they are concerned about the role it's going to take. So,
thank you to the UCID Independent Society for asking that question and for being here tonight. First Nation deaths in custody are at an appalling rate. What can you do to change this?
Yeah, the Closing the Gap report is one of the most horrible experiences in Parliament, I'd say, every year. You sit there and listen to the government and the opposition say a lot of well-meaning things around the lack of progress on closing the gap. But I'd say since the referendum, the government has been very timid when it comes to addressing inequity when it comes to First Nations, and death in custody are still occurring. The frustrating part is there's a huge amount of recommendations from the Royal Commission into death in custody that remain unimplemented, and that is just nonsensical. It's so frustrating. There's actually a huge number of recommendations across a lot of different areas, from Joint Standing Committee reports to Royal Commission recommendations that haven't yet been enacted by government, and deaths in custody is one of them. One of the pieces of work that I am doing is around having a Rights of the Child Act. We are signatories to the UN Convention of the Rights of the Child, but we haven't enacted it in law in Australia, and as a result we have a very disparate approach across sectors. So different states have different approach. The age of criminality is 10, and that is, I think, quite mind-boggling that we have passed laws to say that it is illegal for someone under 16 to be on social media, but someone as young as 10 can be held criminally responsible. We have so much disparity in how we treat children, and that's really unacceptable as a developed nation, I think.
And moving on to hate crime law, many vulnerable groups campaign to have new hate crime law extended beyond anti-Semitism. Would the crossbench consider proposing a Human Rights Act for Australia?
Well, that's an even bigger task. I agreed with those push and moved amendments to that effect to broaden that protection. I think there is nothing more disgusting than anti-Semitism and racism, and I supported those legislations. But I feel strongly that all Australians should be protected with that with those laws. That vilification and hate speech is abhorrent, whether it's race-driven or religion-driven or sexual orientation, gender or gender-based, and as such, I pushed for those protections to be afforded to everyone. The government didn't close the door on it, but we're not, and many at the time were supporting that those protections should be afforded more broadly.
Many parties seem to be politicising immigration. What can you do to find and promote independent data? That's moving all over the place. Such as net impact on housing, to put facts ahead of politics.
Yeah, look, I think I'm being really concerned about that polarisation. It's really easy to look at some of our policy failures and blame immigration in a blanket way rather than truly looking at the facts. The numbers do show there was a spike post-COVID. The reality was during COVID, protections like job seeker were afforded to permanent residents and citizens, but not people here on tourist visas, for example, or student visas. So many went home. What we then found ourselves was a real productivity problem in that we had many businesses simply could not find staff to be able to open and operate. So there was a spike in also Australian citizens returning home and temporary visas and skilled visas. That is now balancing back out. Those numbers are dropping, and what you see in the media is a lot of misinformation around looking at total numbers that include Australian citizens returning. They are not always real numbers. And I'm really against this idea that you just blame migrants and migration. And I must say, I find the return to the past as policies of 30 years ago that are being espoused by the opposition party are really ignore what I am proud of when I think of Australia. I've represented Australia at 4 Olympics. I think we're the most amazing country. But part of what I am proud of is actually our fair go and our values and the fact that we are diverse, we are multicultural, we are a modern of course, we are an old nation when we think of it from a First Nations point of view, but we are a modern young nation compared to so many other nations. And I think our strength is that diversity. And in fact, the data around the productivity of people who come here, and the Mayor and I are often in this place for citizenship ceremonies, and it is the most amazing experience where people who have been in our community, sometimes for years and years, working, paying taxes, who have decided to take that final step of becoming citizens because they want to take on that extra responsibility. It is so exciting and moving to watch because they are here because they want to make Australia the biggest and best nation possible. And I think that's exciting. So I'm very against that rhetoric.
Why isn't it up?
I like that technology's working.
What is your stand on freedom of speech? Should we be allowed to criticise any nation for genocide?
Look, freedom of speech is incredibly important. We don't have a Human Rights Act in Australia, in our constitution, and we don't have but we have an inferred right of freedom of political communication and of freedom of speech. But I want to be really clear. Freedom of speech is not, and the High Court has found this, is not a right to lie. So, for example, truth in political advertising does not contradict the freedom of speech. A right to free speech is not a right to lie, and it is not a right to hate. And that's why I did support the hate crimes legislation. Now, in relation to criticism, that this is a fairly vexed area, and obviously there's a lot of cases going through the courts, testing some of the legislation, testing the protest laws, for example. I anticipate some of the laws passed in Queensland around certain phrases are going to be tested in courts. And I think I have confidence in our system where we have that separate arm of the judiciary that tests the laws and holds government to account where it overreaches beyond constitutional boundaries. So I think it is really important that we maintain that those rights. They are intrinsic in a liberal democracy, but they still require that level of respect for others, and they are not rights to lie, and they are not rights to hate speech or to threaten, intimidate, and others. And there are many in our community, in particular Jewish Australians, who have felt very targeted, and so they absolutely must be protected, as should everyone in our community be protected.
How do you think the government is handling the US alliance?
I've got all the easy questions. Look, I've got to be honest, it's really difficult. So AUKUS was agreed. Obviously, Australia has a long-standing alliance with the US. That goes without saying, and that is under... Obviously, the current presidency in the US is challenging, and briefings from the government have certainly recognise that it is very unpredictable and a very frequently changing situation for the very top level of decision makers as well as us in the community. AUKUS is really challenging. I accept that we have a defensive need as an island nation and continent, that we must have those capabilities. And in changing geopolitical environment, it's important that we do invest in defence. I should say, though, I am concerned, I do feel defence has to be held to the same standards as other areas within our budget priorities, and we can't just have a blank cheque and unchecked growth when it comes to defence spending. When it comes to AUKUS, the difficulty is it was announced by Scott Morrison when he was Prime Minister. The Labor government, Anthony Albanese's opposition, agreed to it within 24 hours. I don't believe there was any consultation, any analysis of document. I just don't know. There has never really been an opportunity to properly test the case for the scale of the investment that's been committed to. It is obviously a long-term commitment. I've had many briefings with the Deputy Prime Minister, Richard Marles, and Defence around that. They are confident that we will obtain the necessary submarine capacity in the time that we need it. Now, experts have briefed me that some of our kind of drop-dead dates are 2028 is a key date, because the Collins-class submarines will be at end of life by 2032, and so there is that timeline of when we need to obtain replacements. Obviously 2028, the US is still under a Trump presidency, and so that question of certainty is difficult. But ultimately, I think the Australia-US alliance is core to Australian defence position, but I do think it's important that we, as middle powers, keep developing greater relationships with other nations as well. So it was really interesting being in Parliament when Mark Carney addressed the Parliament, when we had, of course, Ursula, and I can't think of her last name, from the EU. Really interesting to hear their comments around that, reaching out to Australia around trade opportunity, defence opportunities, and how middle powers can in fact create a little bit more resilience to being too dependent on superpowers, especially where they are unpredictable. And I have raised concerns with the government that Australia not be involved in any conflict, that is not something I'm getting any will from our community about wanting us to be involved in that conflict.
Okay, so we're just going to do 3 more questions, because I know you've got a few things to say at the end, and I'm conscious of people having some time to talk to you directly. There's almost no young people in this room tonight.
I can see a few. Come on.
Everything's relative, isn't it? How are you reaching my sons and the young people who are in their early 20s?
Yeah, look, it's really important that we hear from everyone in the community. So I would say if you have young adult children or encouraging them to be involved, I do always say to young people, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. You may not be interested in politics, but politics is making decisions about your life and your future, and it will impact your opportunities. So it's really important to get engaged and involved. We do try and engage with young people as much as possible, obviously through forums, through schools, through universities as well, and obviously then work experience and other opportunities. But it's an ongoing challenge, because a lot of the decisions that we're making now and laws we're passing now will very much impact the lives of young people. And we know they are really unhappy demographic, right? Because there are so many areas of intergenerational inequity, from the revenue and tax, from housing, access to housing, from job disruption and opportunity. HECS debts is a huge one. So there is a really big concern, and it's incumbent on all of us to make sure that everyone within the community feels supported and addressed. Sure. You'll have to use this one.
I'll use this one. Just a quick advertisement for any young people in the room, or parents, or anyone who's in touch with young people between the ages of sort of 15 to 25. We have been, through the youth centre here in Mosman, we've been doing some research around what are the key issues facing young people in our community. Tomorrow evening we're hosting from 7 p.m. in the library for anyone in that age group. I'm hosting a discussion forum with young people to come along, hear from myself and the youth centre and the school captain from Mosman High, who's been helping with that research, to just go through. This is the first step in trying to identify what are the key issues for the young people and what can we do as a community and as council to help them. So that's something proactive that we're doing. Tomorrow, if anyone can spread the word for me, that would be terrific. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
We talked about a focus on properties and the number of properties for negative gearing and CGT, but has a values-based alternative been considered? So with capital gains tax, has it been considered that the value of properties be considered rather than the number of properties?
Look, I can appreciate that concern, because I think obviously people with lower values versus much higher values, it ultimately be a difference. To be honest, the government hasn't really shared what it's looking at or how it's going to approach the question. If I think of the superannuation changes it did, it just looked at it from a value point of view of anything over 3 million. At the moment, what we're hearing is that it's going to be on a number of property basis, so that it would be, but the capital gains changes would be for all investment properties, so irrespective of values, it would be a 33%, versus negative gearing is where they're proposing that it be on two properties. I need to wait and see the detail, I think, but I think that's a you know, I've certainly had that aspect put to me around values across, you know, a number of small properties versus one very big high value property.
And I think this is the perfect one to end on, which is, are you going to run again in 2028? And I think
I feel like we've only just finished the last election. I mean, look, this is where it gets really frustrating, that 3-year terms is really short, and I feel like we just finished one campaign, the government kind of drags its feet, and we eventually get to Parliament about 6 months after an election. It's this slow agenda we have a bit of an agenda for 12 to 18 months, and then they get back on the campaign trail. So at state government level, you've got 4-year terms, which I think would be much better at federal, but that requires constitutional change, which is, I don't think the Prime Minister is keen on another referendum anytime soon. But I have actually proposed to them that a solution could be, every time we go to the polls for a federal election, we could in fact have a constitutional question. You could have a referendum at the same time on a question, because you're already incurring the costs of rolling out the AEC and all the booths and everyone's there. You could actually have a constitutional question at that point that could then come into effect later. It's what they do in the US in a lot of their sort of districts and state elections, and I think that could be a way we start modernising some of our systems. But yes, no, I do plan to continue. Look, my commitment is overwhelming. My husband Tim is here, so no. But no, it's an incredible privilege to represent our community in Parliament. And I've got to be honest, there are days when it's frustrating, where I listen to some of the debate in question time. We have briefings with the Prime Minister, and I do get frustrated at times at the unwillingness to just step up to some of the things that need to happen. But I am committed to the long haul, because I think we have such potential and opportunity in this incredible country. And of all my careers between sport and law and now politics, this is the most incredibly exhilarating and fascinating one. There is very few areas where you have an opportunity to impact someone's life in a very direct way. As Jill said, people often come to our office with a problem around NDIS or aged care or Centrelink and visas, and they are quite desperate. It is really dire, and it's very distressing. And so to be in a position to make sure that we do help to the best of our capacity the community in that way is an incredible privilege to do that. And then to be in the Parliament shaping those laws where you have that opportunity to create a better future, I think is incredibly important. As a barrister, I had that. The job was to do the best I could to argue with the law of the day to the judge for the best outcome possible for my client. But you're always limited by the laws that were in place. And so if you're frustrated with the status quo, you're frustrated with policies, the only way we can change that is by changing the laws. And the only way you change those laws is by being in Parliament. So I remain very focused on that. And I guess this is a good way for me to finish on from closing is, obviously, the question for me always with the government is it acting in the public interest? And I think that's a real question we have of government. And that's where in the last term I passed 18 amendments on behalf of our community, and I keep pushing to try and get the government to pass better laws, because I know the impact of bad laws is a lot of money gets spent on lawyers in courts trying to then fight them and get that interpretation. So I do know firsthand the benefit of better laws and how they work. And so, of course, from housing, public land, generational equity, and around the housing we haven't touched on tonight, but a big piece around the resilience is we need to build better. We need to build climate resilience so that insurance can be affordable, but that they can withstand the kind of events we know are coming. We need much better long-term thinking and practical reform, and I think that's where we can make sure community interest is served, not vested interest, not just big interest. So just my final remarks that I've got from the team that I've got to share is there is some information on the table at the entrance around our seniors guide, which is around help to navigate a very complex system between local, state and federal rules around that, and they are constantly changing. A sustainability guide in how you can electrify your home, take advantage of the home battery scheme, which has been a huge success and is absolutely making significant difference. And what it does is when our urban communities go to rooftop solar and batteries, it puts less pressure on the grid. So it means there is less requirement for large-scale renewable energy zones in regional areas and less requirement for transition, right? So you would think regional communities would be really excited that urban communities are really getting on board when it comes to electrification of households, because that takes that pressure off the grid, which is so important. So there's a Team Zali Climate Action Group. They're standing down there by the table. You can pick up copies of the Sustainability Guide and the new EV supplement. They help with a lot of information, but they're also offering to host information sessions with experts to help you electrify your home, including solar batteries, but also for apartments. So a lot of people think stratas and apartments, it's too hard, but in fact it absolutely can be done. We have the technology and we have great case studies where it's already been done. So if anyone's interested, please go and let the team know. They're here to help. I'd also like to talk, there's a Solar Ambassador program, which is where a team of trained volunteers working with local council, they analyse the rooftop capacity or potential of your house or strata, and they can provide assistance on request around that. And they're always looking for more champions that are keen to help our community do this. Again, there's no perfect solution, but the best way to get on with it is, rather than thinking of all the obstacles, it's thinking of all the opportunities. I always think the glass is half full, and we can absolutely keep making a huge difference. I hope I've answered most of the questions, which if not, I'll be here for a little bit longer, but if not, please keep getting in touch with the office. We do our best to respond as quickly as we can. There is, as Jill said, my inbox is like a never-ending bucket that doesn't ever empty, but we do our best to address everyone's concerns and help everyone as much as we can. But thank you so much for coming tonight. Remember, Friday 8th of May for the information session by Defence in relation to HMAS Penguin. Thank you.